Okay, it looks like we've let in everybody from the waiting room, so we'll go ahead and start. So welcome everyone. This is Collective Memory of Diverse Women Architects. I'm Naomi Horowitz, and I'm here on behalf of Women Who Design. We're hosting this event. And I wanted to tell you just a little bit about us before we start. We formed this organization to pursue a different kind of exhibition about women in architecture. And instead of the more typical sort of boards on walls showcasing the accomplishments of distinguished individuals, what we wanted to do was provide a platform for exploring the lived experiences of a diverse array of women. With this concept came an approach that builds the exhibition through storytelling, interaction, and collaboration. Of course, we didn't do this, on our own. In addition to the steering committee, we had a great independent jury that selected a short list of exhibitors. And of course, like so much else in the world, the pandemic reshaped how we could share this exhibition. But we believe, given the international range of everyone who has responded to the initial call for entry and everyone who has participated in the exhibit itself and the associated event series, that actually this project has benefited from going online. And if you want to see more about everyone who's been involved in making this exhibit possible, you can check out our website, www.womenwhodesign.org, and also please follow us on Instagram at @thewomenswhodesign. So in this context, we're thrilled to introduce today's event, which is so beautifully aligned with our goals, inviting the disciplines of architectural history and archives to collaborate, and challenging them to consider with fresh eyes what stories and whose stories are told and preserved. This is actually the third live program associated with the exhibition, following Staying Connected to Advance, which was a panel about career experiences, and Today's Dilemma, which was a hands-on digital collage workshop. We also have a couple of artist Q&A sessions coming up once the exhibition itself launches. I've already mentioned that we'll be keeping cameras and microphones off for everyone except the panelists and the moderator during the event. I'll also mention that this event will be recorded and available on the exhibition website once that launches. One more housekeeping note, which is that we invite everyone to ask questions through the chat function. Write them in there. We'll be compiling those questions for the Q&A session at the end. I would also like at this time to recognize the Organization of Women Architects and Design Professionals, who's been our biggest sponsor, and who are also the source of this great historical photo from 1974 that you see up there. And with that, I'd like to hand off to our moderator, Meral Ikinci-Oğlu, who has crafted today's event and assembled this wonderful panel of scholars. Meral.
Okay, thanks, Naomi, and thanks, Women Who Design team. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our online panel, Collective Memory of Diverse Women Architects, its practice and methods, organized by Women Who Design team. I am Meral Ikinci-Oğlu, scholar in post-war architecture history and the moderator of this panel. And as we have been going through a global pandemic with deep-seated inequalities in architecture and with critical discussions in architecture history on this issue, our online panel aims to bring into focus the importance of historical documentation practice and its methods on women architects from underrepresented groups and communities. We think that it is time to establish new and effective dialogues between architecture history and the field of archive in relation to our panel topic. And with this effort, we want to be a part of solution and to motivate relevant institutions, organizations, and people to take concrete actions for more inclusive archives and collections on diverse women architects rather than spotlighting the accomplishment of prominent individuals. And now I would like to introduce our four panelists. Mary Norman Woods is Professor Emerita at Cornell University. In 1991, she became the first woman tenured in Cornell's architecture department, founded in 1871, where she was also inaugural Michael McCarthy Chair of Architectural Theory. She is the author of several books, including Women Architects in India, Histories of Practice in Mumbai and Delhi, Beyond the Architect's Eye, Photographs of the American Built Environment, and From Craft to Profession, Practice of Architecture in the 19th Century America. And her current projects include a documentary film and an exhibition in relation to India, and a book on post-industrial landscapes in India and the United States. Heather Isbell Schumacher is archivist of the Architectural Archives at University of Pennsylvania Weizmann Schools of Design. She received her master's degree in public history from Temple University, oversees the stewardship of and access to more than 400 design-related collections, and believes that archives cannot and should not be neutral spaces, but rather tools for liberation. And Jessica Quagliaroli is the architecture record archivist at Yale University, and her current position focuses on the arrangement and description of architectural archives collections, outreach and spatial collections instructions to Yale University Schools of Architecture, its faculty and students. She previously worked as an archivist at the Architect of the Capitol and an active member of the Design Records section of the Society of American Archivists. And Maristela Casciaro is Senior Curator, Head of Architecture, Spatial Collections at the Getty Research Institute. She is an architect, architecture historian, former professor at the University of Bologna in architecture, has been Mellon Senior Fellow at Canadian Centre for Architecture, prior to being appointed Associate Director of Research at the same institute. And in terms of our panelist order, firstly, I would like to ask Mary, and then Heather, Jessica, and Maristella. And we would be very happy to know your questions to our panelists into our chat box for our 15 minutes question and answer session. If you would like a specific panelist to answer your question, please mention the panelist's name first, then the question. In addition, if we have questions remaining at the end of the program, we will be happy to share your questions with our panelists to request their answers at their convenience. And for each panel question or request from our panelists is to deliver a 3-minute answer. And after their 3 minutes answers, we will have open response to each other for 5 minutes before our next question. Now I would like to begin our online panel with our first question. According to your experience in your field, what problems are essential and current regarding the inclusion of diverse women architects? Mary, what would you like to say about this question?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Maral, for such a gracious and generous introduction. It's always somewhat dubious to be the first woman tenured at Cornell, particularly since the school was founded in 1871 and I was tenured in 1991. But at least I'm a footnote in its history. And I also very much like to thank you and your colleagues at Women Who Design for this and your other timely programs, much needed. I'm also honored to be a part of this extremely distinguished panel, and I'm looking forward to questions from the audience members too. And I am so sorry that Professor Kenneth Frampton will not be with us this evening. It goes without saying he will be very much missed, and I hope you'll be able to include him in another one of your sessions. Now to your first question. A central and still persistent issue is that women are more likely to be the guardians and keepers of the archives in the past and even today, rather than being found in those archives as subjects. Women have been educated and have practiced in architecture and other design fields since the late 19th and early 20th centuries in both the global North and the global South. Nevertheless, there's still barely a trace of their lives and works in major architectural archives. Women I have found in my brief surveys account for at best a little more than 1% of all of those represented in these archives. Now, of course, this is also true for designers marginalized by their race, class, religion, locales, nationalities, and unconventional practices, and even more so for those at the intersections of these identities. Our challenges, but I hope also opportunities, are to critically examine what the archives have been, what they are now, and what they might become. This involves, as my colleague, Professor Samia Henney has astutely observed, quote, understanding the objects of the archives as carriers of histories through not only the aspects of those objects, but specifically through what is not visible on those objects. That is, learning to read the archives against the grain, end quote. Now, later on in response to the other questions, I will discuss individuals, particularly women in India, who have been reading the archives against the grain. They have reimagined, I believe, how we design, teach, and learn by giving a voice and a place to those hitherto ignored or erased in the archives. And these Indian colleagues and friends are very much in my thoughts and prayers at this terrible time for them and their country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. And Heather, what would you like to say about this question?
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. And I hope that I don't have a lot of background noise. Apologies if that comes up. I'm in my enclosed front porch here, which provides a nice background, but hopefully not too much noise. So when I sat down and thought about this question, it brought up the idea that as somebody working in architectural archives, I'm sort of constantly thinking about is this intersection of these two fields, how they interact, you know, the various challenges and opportunities within them. And so the first thought I really had was that, you know, as archivists who are primarily concerned with collecting historical records, the elephant in the room is really that architecture has been a white male-dominated field for much of its history. And, you know, many of us are from institutions where women were admitted to studio classes quite late relative to the founding of the school, as Mary can attest. So, the recording of the history of architecture, the built environment, the creative process, the latter of which the Architectural Archives is primarily concerned with in our collecting, is that there's really already a disadvantage for representing women. Even for, you know, female superstars of architecture, their work hasn't always held the same value as their male counterparts. That's not to say the stories don't exist, right? However, the practice of archives can often compound the issues of visibility. The practice of provenance, in particular, preserves the attribution of a primary creator. But as those of us who work with these collections, we know that a lot of hands are involved in the creation of drawings and models and other parts of the design process. We often don't catalog things at that level, at the item level. So it can be difficult to get those stories out. I think digital humanities projects offer an opportunity to do that, but require resources that a lot of institutions don't necessarily have, not only in the short term, but in the long term. And finally, there's a lot of time involved in staff and experts finding those. And I think the last thing we need to do as archivists is to look critically at our collecting missions for inherent biases that have perhaps perpetuated the erasure of not only women, but other BIPOC and other underrepresented communities in the field. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Heather. And Jessica, what would you like to say about our question?
Yeah, thank you, Maral. So from an archival perspective, what I have to say will really build nicely off of what Heather just said. I see that there are two sort of major problems. The first is, like what Heather just mentioned, the financial and labor-intensive resources that it takes to properly care for and steward architectural collections. And the second is the past collecting efforts, which can make it really difficult to acquire new collections or to spend the time sort of mining existing collections for voices, silenced voices, gaps within these collections. And often the limited resources that repositories have are already committed to maintaining their current architectural collections. And this might include conservation work that drawings often need if they're used a lot by researchers or for instruction, purchasing supplies, the cost of storing oversized objects, 3D objects. So it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg situation. And I often see that the first problem is exacerbated by the second problem. So when I think about what is essential to acquiring collections from women architects or architects from marginalized and underrepresented communities, I think it's essential that we acknowledge our past collecting practices and to think critically about how collecting priorities can be shifted and where the resources can be reallocated if at all possible.
Thanks so much. Maricela, what would you like to share with us?
Well, first of all, a good evening and thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be in this group of panels. It has been already said, I'm an architect and an architectural historian. Actually, at a certain point, I even passed the exams. So I am a registered architect. I feel like I could be on the other side of where I am now because I never had a professional career, but I moved to architectural history before to be involved in this archival work. And nowadays, as you mentioned, I'm the curator, the senior curator at the Getty Research Institute for Special Collection, where I work with acquisition, of course, a major issue, and then developing research projects and curating exhibition. Now, it has been already said, but I want to really reinforce this, that some of our collection in many institutions, they show the persistence, at least at the Getty, of a Western hegemony and a powerful character of a male-oriented profession with a strong gender imbalance. But this is an inheritance that the collection can't be made to account for. Today, we need to ask, how was that power at the time constituted and at the expenses of whom? We say the women, of course, and other diverse groups, but we need to go deeper into this. Just a few words about the female presence in our collection. Limited, yes, but also very relevant. But again, Ray Eames, for instance, obviously in collaboration with Charles, and Elaine Gray, in this case, as a professional architect, and Zaha Hadid with a group of drawings for an installation of the Russian avant-garde exhibition at the Guggenheim. And then I want to mention a very interesting case study, which is the one of Deborah Sussman, a renowned graphic designer and principal in her office, who was responsible for advertising and programming for the LA Olympics in 1984. And a final example is the one of Ada Louise Axtable. It's a unique documentation of a woman working in the field of architecture. Because basically she invented for herself the role of the architecture critic and was the first woman to hold this position, the architecture critic of the New York Times for 19 years. One challenge that we have when we have those archives is that we need, it has been already mentioned, we need to dig up into the collection of the male architect and find the female voice, the partners, because their voices are often invisible. And it is our responsibility to give authorship back to the women who have been the creator of the work. This is a case, that I faced recently, working again with the catalogers of the Frank Gehry papers, and to discover the contribution of several design and graphic designer, the contribution of Deborah Sassman, Georg Kavanagh, and to also find their original drawings. So we need to work against, as Mary mentioned, against the grain and found the voices. Thank you at this point for your first questions. We start the second.
Thanks, Maricela. And dear panelists, would you like to say any additional comments to each other's answers, or can we move on to the next question? Okay, so I would like to ask our second question. How can we raise awareness of each other's work for more inclusive architecture history and archives collections in relation to diverse women architects? Mary, what would you like to say?
All right, well, thank you again, and thank you for all of the wonderful responses of my fellow panelists to the first question. I think we're all in agreement that archives must become inclusive in terms of race, class, and gender identities, but they also need to collect the representative as well as the exceptional. The local and the regional must also have a place in the archive. As my colleague Jorge Regal says, the center can often be seen with greater clarity and greater criticality from the edges. The acquisition, organization, and accessibilities of collections can enable us to understand design, as Heather and Jessica have mentioned, as a collaborative process across people and disciplines and spaces. Opened in 2015, the CEPT Archives of Modern Architecture, Planning, and Design is part of one of India's leading schools of design. Some of CEPT's materials are beginning to form constellations rather than simply collections of singular stars. Ishita Shah was the CEPT archivist and curator who acquired the papers of architect and designer Hema Sankalia, who is one of India's first women architects. She was also a designer, so she worked at many different scales. Sankalia was also a close collaborator of Charles Correa. Now, while the Correa papers are at the Royal Institute of British Architects and also at his own foundation in Goa, any institution or individual can subscribe to his digitized papers through the foundation. And this is what the CEPT Archives in Ahmedabad did. Now, Sankalia's analog papers can be read in conjunction with Correa's digitized ones and vice versa. So it creates an ability to read across collections that are often siloed. Milka Bliznikov, architecture professor at Virginia Tech University, knew an archive would ensure that legacies of pioneering women would not be forgotten. In 1985, she founded the International Archive for Women Architects, the IAWA, at Virginia Tech. She assiduously collected the papers of not only pioneering designers, but also innovators in materials, technology, sustainability, management, history, conservation, and activism from across the world and across the centuries. Professor Donna Dunay, who is the current IAWA director, has expanded the archive's reach and scope with her seminal Peace Project, which was launched in 2018. Thus, any woman anywhere in the world can donate what she considers a seminal drawing or design to what is now an open archive for the representative as well as the exceptional woman at the International Archives of Women Architects. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Heather, what would you like to say about our second question?
Yeah, I want to build on what Mary mentioned about these sort of collecting networks, right? I think all of us in collecting institutions are used to this idea of sort of knowing who the players are and finding the stories and then going after, going after those collections. And at the Architectural Archives, we're doing that. We have, you know, collections related to the Philadelphia School, Lou Kahn, Venturi Scott Brown, Mitchell Jurgala, and we're, you know, those are the big players. We have them, they're solidified. We've spent many years building relationships with those firms, people who worked within those firms over many years. And it's helped us discover these sort of concentric, you know, other concentric circles within those networks to really represent not just, as Mary was saying, these sort of, you know, top level people who, you know, are thinking archivally about their stuff already, but also maybe, you know, the people who were there on the scene and are contributing to the built environment in interesting ways, but who maybe haven't, you know, thought about where their collection might go, or just looking at their stuff, you know, in a historic way like that. I think it's essential that archivists and users of archives understand the nature of the work of one another. We spent a lot of time with the patrons in our reading room, you know, understanding what it is they're working on and guiding them through the collection. And in return, I always feel a little bit of a responsibility to explain sort of the practice of archives, how collections are developed, how they're brought in, you know, how they're arranged. Surprisingly, people, especially students, are really interested in this. A lot of the questions sort of revolve around, well, how did this get here? You know, why is it arranged this way? Why are, you know, some parts of the collection over here and others over here? So I think, you know, part of our responsibility is to just, you know, educate people about those practices, and also to allow feedback to us about how people are using our materials. I think we all need to be invested, regardless of our field of archives or architectural history. We all need to be invested in the work of engaging underrepresented communities within our respective fields. I see that as a core responsibility of making sure that, you know, colleagues I'm working with, you know, have different voices and, you know, are contributing to our work in that way. And I think it's really important for archivists to be embedded in the education of architecture and design students. We certainly have opportunities for that. We would love more opportunities for that. It always elicits really engaging conversation, and again, feeds back information to us about how students, current students, are thinking about design, what kinds of questions they have. We spend a lot of time tailoring these tabletop tours that are now pretty much all virtual. We've adapted in that way. And it's just, you know, it's the only way that we get this stuff out there in the world and are able to, you know, to have these really important conversations with the youngest generation entering the profession.
Thank you, Heather. And Jessica?
Thank you. So as an archivist who works in an academic setting, I see my role in raising awareness of architectural historians' work really as supporting the architecture students that I interact with, both undergraduate and graduate, and the work that they produce. So I really strive to encourage and amplify their work, both in sort of like the traditional use of archival materials and the non-traditional. One example is that I served as a library advisor for an undergraduate architecture major who put together an exhibit on the first female graduates of the Yale School of Architecture. I'll be happy to find the link and put that in the chat later. And the second sort of slightly more nuanced way that I see my role is sort of what Heather just mentioned, and that's through my special collections instruction work. And in general, I work a lot with architecture students that are in the theory, history, and criticism track of either the architecture major or from the Masters of Environmental Design program, which is very research oriented. So I'm working primarily with students that are going to go on in their careers to produce research and projects in architectural and design history. So in my instruction sessions, I talk a lot about silences in the archives, right, which we kind of touched on in the first question. We talk a lot about who's represented, who's not, what voices and perspectives are there, what voices and perspectives are not. And I talk to students about what we can learn from those silences. And for architectural collections specifically, this is very useful when consulting the archives of a large firm or of a singular architect. For example, I've used construction drawings to talk about the labor that goes into the actual construction of a building and the laborers that are doing the actual construction work, which is a perspective that goes beyond just looking at, you know, Eero Saarinen's beautiful, humongous design development drawings, right? And then, you know, I really like how Mary put this, really talking to students about how we can read across collections and read against the archival grain, and how we can take different context clues to really like build our understanding, right, of where the hidden voices are, where those silences are, and what we can learn from them. So I sort of see my role of raising awareness of what's going on with architectural history is from where the students are at in their education, right, where they're at their point of need.
Thank you, Jessica. And Maristela?
Yes, let's say that I have the feeling, being the last, I mean, always in the panel, that we share a lot of ideas, and for major institutions who have archive, and as the one where I'm working now, I think that at least I see myself, it's essential to have a stronger presence outside the walls of our archival vaults. And as we say, we need to start to begin a professional interaction with women who design and other communities. Students are, in a way, an important component, but let's also go out into the world. And I noticed that for me, it's crucial to go and meet the women in their own environment, in their work environment, and to engage with active and diverse group and welcome them to gain a presence inside the institution, so that the institution is not in the archive a separate entity. In this way, it's not only a way to increase the inclusivity, but also to start to break some barriers between the top, the institution, and the lower presence. I noticed, this is my experience, that how sometimes women architects, younger, sometimes, I mean, mid-career even, they are often intimidated by the power of an institution. And one strategy that I'm adopting is to allow the young professional to gain awareness about the importance of the archive as a testimony of their own work and their own legacy. And so to educate them to create their own archive. And under this perspective, it's essential to support the production, for instance, of architectural monograph, exhibition, and when possible, also to offer new digital platform to increase the voices to be widely spread. I mean, we talk about cross collection, but also we need to to increase the voices at a very wide territory. And I want also to finally to touch upon what I see as a change in the profession. I worked for more than 2 decades in a non-profit organization for the documentation and conservation of modern heritage. And it's clear to me that now are the women becoming the leader in the process of development of conservation processes. And I'm now working in the acquisition of a women archive, and she has been the first, I mean, in Los Angeles, in charge of conservation of very important landmark in downtown LA. And recently I asked her, why and when did you start? I mean, why you took this specific field of the profession? And she very bluntly and very clearly answered my question and said, when I began, I mean, in the late 70s, my colleague, the architects, were not interested in this job offers. They thought this was not a creative process. This is not architecture. It's nothing more than redecorating of adding wallpaper. We know that the profession is very different. And when I see the list of her successful projects, I mean, it's absolutely impressive. And so I think, I mean, the Bradbury building, a few of that, Bradbury building, Griffith Auditorium, the LA Town Hall. I mean, for people who have an awareness of Los Angeles, they know this is important. So we also have to discover in the profession where are the niches, where the women are really the principal and really the relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcela. And our final panel question, what can be done for collaborative action by institutions and programs in your field in order to develop more inclusive historical documentation practice and methods on diverse women architects? Mary, what would you like to say about this?
I'm not so sure maybe I should cede the pole position to someone else. Perhaps we should have mixed this up. So anyway, in response to the final question, I'll just say that we as individuals and also the different institutions that we are a part of, we must begin to support and contribute to reimagined archives, again, that read against the grain of the traditional archive as we know it, but has also been so eloquently pointed out outside the walls of those archives as well. Writer and scholar C.S. Lakshmi created Sparrow, the Sound and Picture Archives for Research on Women, in 1988. It is a community archive based in Mumbai, and it's free of any institutional control. Dr. Lakshmi says, quote, "Every woman has achieved something through acts of assertion. I don't think there is any history that is not worth being seen and retrieved," end quote. As the first collection in India focusing on women and visual and audio materials, Sparrow's workshops and programs enable women of all caste, classes, and communities to tell their stories. It then conserves and then it broadcasts their work. And here it's extremely important that it's not just in English or Hindi, but it's in a variety of Indian languages as well. Because of their diversity and inclusion, such community archives as Sparrow are now attracting institutional interest. In 2019, the Mellon Foundation held a conference on how institutions can partner with community archives. But the issue is how to bring outside funding and expertise without compromising the community's autonomy and control of their own archives. Brenda Somaya and Chitra Vishwanath, architects in Mumbai and Bangalore respectively, are creating archives between the covers of architectural monographs. Their publications include but go beyond the monograph's usual imagery, analysis, and documentation. Somaya's 2018 monograph included dialogues with those from outside as well as inside architecture, and quite remarkably, I think, photographs of how her buildings have been changed by time, weather, and their users. Vishwanath is recasting the monograph as intimate and inexpensive diaries about her and her partner's practice called Biome Solutions. There are, in addition to the typical essays, drawings, sketches, and photographs, and here in full disclosure, I was asked and was honored to contribute an afterword to one of the diaries. There are also poems, short stories, cartoons, graphic novels, and oral histories. Colleagues and clients, but also friends, builders, artists, and skilled and unskilled construction workers tell Biome's many stories. Now here my one male colleague in India, Nipun Prabhakar, whom I'll mention tonight, is photographing Charles Correa's buildings today and interviewing the women and men who still use and care for these buildings. Through these images and words, the buildings themselves will create an archive about their lives lived apart from the architect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And Heather?
This is one instance where I'm really happy to go right after Mary because she so perfectly sort of leads me into the main thing I want to use to talk about how the Architectural Archives at University of Pennsylvania is working on this. We are currently beginning a grant from the Pew Foundation to examine the work of Minerva Parker Nichols, who was the first independent female architect, we think, in the country. We have a handful of her drawings in our collection that we've used to teach for years, always knowing there was more to the story. We had a graduate student, Molly Lester, who wrote a thesis about Minerva several years ago, and it's taken us several years to get here. But the aim of the project is to document Minerva's existing work. We're working with an architectural photographer, Elizabeth Villicella, to go out and photograph the public buildings that still stand. She did a lot of commissions for women, especially suffragists in the area. Residences that still stand, so we're working with homeowners and building networks of stewards and caretakers there. But really the aim beyond the monograph, and I love talking about this idea of the usefulness of the monograph and the problems that it creates sometimes, is that really we're looking to build a toolkit about how to stop perpetuating erasures in archives and to do better in our respective professions, which are architecture, archives, and historic preservation. We feel like we all need sort of different tools, and we felt like those three fields in particular opened a wide range of conversations about how we do the work we do. So we are building an archive in the absence of one. And I watched Mary's video about from last year at the Women in Design 2020, and she mentioned Minette De Silva's book, which I was like, oh, I audited a class about 2 years ago now, and we looked at that, and it wasn't until I rewatched that I thought, oh my God, this is maybe how we want to think about framing some of our work with the Minerva project. So thank you, Mary. It's very generative. So that there's ways to build an archive for women who are no longer here, and to document their work that may have been lost. But also, going forward, how do we work with existing architects in thinking about documenting their work? And I'll put a link as a little plug. I'll put a link in the chat here.
Thank you, Heather. And Jessica?
Yeah, thinking about this question, I kept going back to the main point that I had in the last question, which is, in my position within this academic role, is to really be a supporter and amplifier, especially for non-traditional archival projects that fill a need and fill a gap that traditional archives sometimes cannot. Not that we're not trying or lack of wanting to, but for reasons we discussed earlier, maybe just the resources, both financial and staffing, are not there. So one example of this is the Yale Masters of Environmental Design Working Group for Anti-Racism held virtual forums in the fall of 2020. And one was on the topic of archive, which was put in loose quotations. And the forum highlighted the work of, quote, 3 individuals who have built distinct archives of diverse scopes and localities, centering on BIPOC spaces, individuals, and histories, end quote. And 2 of these projects, for example, were Amrita Raja's The Counter Canon Project and Mel Isidore's Voice at the Table. These are not traditional archives, but as an archivist, I can still support and amplify these projects that fill that need that traditional archives and traditional collecting have not. And I still would consider them archives, even if they are not, you know, the traditional archive, in that it is a collection of resources that is filling a research need. And I think in this way, sort of like building a bridge and reaching out and really, like, as the archivist, stepping outside of the wall, stepping outside the boundaries, that's one really effective way to start opening up these lines of communication. So like Mary, Maristella, Heather have all really eloquently talked about, you know, really sort of planting the seed that the archives is a place for everybody's collections and everybody's voices, and also reminding ourselves as the archivist, you know, what our charge is, right? Yeah, sorry, I kind of went off on a little tangent there.
Thank you, Jessica. And Maristella?
Yes, Jessica, you never went outside. I mean, I think that we are here talking about our institution and archival institution from very diverse perspective, because I mean, both Heather and Jessica work in a more closely to an academic environment. If I think about the Getty Research Institute, I see, and your question here, Meryl, I mean, for me, the question remains, how do I put a priority in my work as a curator for changing and diversifying what I think are the weakest element in this discussion, the educational program. I mean, the GRI holds the archive, but again, you need to understand who are the users and how do you make the presence of the archive more relevant in School of Architecture, for instance, both undergraduate and master program. I mean, and then that's what I'm doing now. We are not an academic institution, as you probably understand, but Los Angeles is full of program in architecture and PhD program in history and theory. So to increase the role of the archive in the educational program. And I do teach seminar and classes for those schools. I mean, they come to the GRI, to our reading rooms, but the issue is that you have to start every time, I mean, to go beyond the surfaces, as we say, of the well-known pioneers. I mean, if there is a malaise in architecture education, it's also the responsibility of our institution. And so it's always the same for me, starting asking the question, whose stories you want to tell, and for what's your audience? And I, as Mary also has been working in non-Western countries, I've been also working as an architectural historian in non-Western countries, and I always start, I mean, from the non-Western culture, interrogating the archive. The problem here, and I would like to talk more with Mary, who mentioned incredible important sources, that the specific in Western country to work on non-Western history of architecture needs a lot of dedication and time. Often we don't have the archive available and we have limited documentary sources. So in order to find the space for other voices and disseminate these unheard stories, sometimes we need to have a whole process and quite an effort. And another aspect that I find interesting in the institution where I work, I mean, are the library collection. We need to increase the library collection. You know, it's easy now to collect the most, the last publication from the European publishers or the, I mean, Western. It's very relevant to be able to go beyond and collect, I mean, from other sources. So it's always an issue of going beyond and going out, in my opinion. And we have quite a lot of questions, but we also have some questions. I think I have some questions for Mary. And so we will start the conversation. Thank you, Meryl.
Thank you. Would you like to say any additional comments to your each other's response?
Mary, I have something I would like you to go back, if I may. Hello?
Sure.
Oh, okay, sorry, I don't, Mary, the idea, you touched on two examples of monographic work, I mean, books that are related to the work of women architects in non-Western countries. And do you think that we really need to change also, I mean, the way we document architecture? I mean, are there other ways to do that? Because, you know, we tend to follow a well-known process. I mean, you have the introductory essays, you have the work, sometimes, I mean, pages of description on the works. I mean, and it's sometimes this is not satisfactory any longer. And it's not for me. And it's one of the issues I always encounter when I go to schools of architecture, and they say, why the architecture history book, they don't talk about those examples? Why this is an unknown history? So we need to change those patterns, I think. And those are the two important examples that you gave, I mean.
Well, you know, absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's very interesting that, you know, Brenda Somaya and Chitra Vishwanath sort of took it upon themselves to create their own archives. And the way they did it was really, I think, subverting our traditional notion of what an archive can be, and also what an architectural monograph can be as well. And particularly in Chitra's case, I mean, I think it's marvelous. I mean, this whole idea of a diary, which, as I said, you know, as a genre, it's intimate, it's personal. It also is very accessible. I mean, she's seen them as really a series of publications. And again, they'll be in many different languages, not just English and Hindi. So the idea is to make them very accessible across India and across the world. And hers is a very international practice in terms of having worked in places like Africa and the Middle East, and also having staff and student interns from around the world. So I'll just give a shout out, anybody who wants to go to Bangalore, if we can ever again, you should definitely look into the work of Biome. And so I think it's really fascinating to tell these stories in many different ways, you know, as I said, through poems, short stories, graphic novels, cartoons. And I'll also just say, I mean, when I first started working in India, and, you know, I was probably, you know, a total idiot to do it. And I only thought I could because I had previously written on the history of architectural practice and education in the United States. And then I encountered so many incredible women there, like Brenda Somaya, who interestingly combined contemporary design and master planning with building conservation, which, as you said, Maristella, you know, was often, you know, derided as not really playing on the main chord of, you know, creative, innovative architectural design. So that's what fascinated, but there were no archives, which I, you know, was accustomed to working with. So I really had to go about, you know, stumbling my way through oral history. And I'll just, you know, quote a comment by Dr. Lakshmi, who founded Sparrow. She said she once went and tried to get funding from a local bureaucrat for the Sparrow archives. And when he said, well, these oral histories, it's just women chit-chatting. That's not history.
You see?
So, I mean, I think we really, and my younger colleagues are certainly doing that. And again, you know, my colleague, Samia Henny, who is using the archive as a basis for an exhibition, and in both the design of the exhibition and its installation, she you know, reinterprets the archival material, or at least a recreation of the archival material. So, I mean, there's this kind of interesting boldness with which she approaches the precious, you know, object from the archive that typically we can only touch with white gloves on the thinking is changing on that. So I think it is very exciting to see these women create their own archives and to, as I said, reimagine them in very creative ways and in bold ways as well.
Well, then.
But I'd like to hear from our archivists too.
No, I think-
want to hear.
Go ahead.
Heather.
No, go ahead.
I mean, what Mary is telling us, and she's very aware of that because of her long expertise in India, that the women, they finally understand that they have to also build their own archive, and they became aware. Now, the next issue for us, I mean, in our institution, is very, very difficult to me to answer. What is the relationship between the institution and those archives? Do we have to move those archives from their original locations? Why do I move an archive from India, I mean, to another country? Do I again have a supremacy and say, oh, I can give perennity to your archive and I move everything to the other side of the world? I mean, in this way, I mean, this is one of my dilemma. I mean, to tell you, I mean, how do I extrapolate the history from the locale, I mean, to another world? And is this something that the archive needs to perform? I don't know. I mean, it's an important issue for me.
Yeah, I think we had a good early conversation about this in the run through, and it didn't come out in this tonight. But yeah, I mean, the idea of, where does the archive physically belong and to whom does it belong? And I mean, Mary, again, probably has, more experience in terms of the, she could talk a little bit about the collections at Cornell as a really good example, but right, like rethinking, me taking in the archive doesn't necessarily, or, Penn getting a collection doesn't necessarily have to look like, that thing coming out of the community, especially community that's, often underrepresented or, oppressed in some way, sort of taking it out of there and moving it to, the academy, the institution.
Yeah.
What is that, what can that partnership relationship, what can our stewardship be in those spaces? I mean, Mary maybe wants to share the Cornell story is, I just think that's a great example of what you're talking about in terms of trying to decolonize and, and to be more thoughtful partners with communities and creators.
Well, since I've been talking a bit, I'd also like to hear from Heather, perhaps before I say anything about that. I'm sorry, Jessica. Jessica, yes.
I think certainly your example, Mary, of like the community archive post-custodial relationship is one that archives can certainly explore. In my specific situation, I am not a lone arranger or a lone archivist, but I am the only architectural archivist and the only sort of like dedicated position within my department to architectural collections. So I do a little bit of everything, including collection development. So my resources and my capacities day to day are quite limited. So I have a very narrow collecting scope. And that's why I focus a lot of my energies when it comes to collections that, frankly, Yale is not the home for whatever reason. I really see my role as being like a liaison or a support system, an amplifier to those researchers or, the communities that have these materials. And in many cases, they don't necessarily want the collections to come to Yale, which is also fine. And so that's where I can, use my expertise and my knowledge to help support those communities or those people to know this is how you can arrange and describe your materials. Here's, a low cost barrier for storing them. Let's work together to look for a more appropriate home for your collection. If it's not at Yale, it might be someplace else. So that's sort of where like I really see my role in those instances.
Yeah, I think, just
Heather,
to add on really quickly, to Jessica, is that, I mean, I think, again, you bring up a good point about resources, right? Like we are all from fairly well-resourced parent institutions, and yet within the archives themselves, we have limited capacities. And, I think a lot more of us want to be doing that sort of work in community archives. But, the resource, and so if we don't have the resources, upstarts and community archives have even fewer resources. So I think, not to beat a dead horse, but the resource issue is prevalent at all levels and can be a challenge to overcome.
And it's really being cognizant too of, yes, we have this very important mission that we do need to diversify our collections, but to do so responsibly, right? And to not take in large collections that we just cannot responsibly steward. That would be a really big disservice. So it's a really fine balance for sure.
And also the archive is not a depository. I mean, it's not a storage. And that's a big responsibility.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it becomes a very complicated issue. And here, I don't want to rag too much on my own institution, but maybe I can do this now since I'm retired from it. But, the example I adduced in terms of the problematic of community archives and their relationship with institutional archives, and as Heather was saying, even they, Cornell, Yale, Penn, the Getty, still are limited in terms of staff, funds, et cetera. But, I've always thought it was somewhat problematic that our hip hop collection, which is fabulous, it was born in the Bronx, and yet it was displaced to centrally isolated upstate New York, really divorced from its community. And, it concerns me. They've had wonderful programming, and they have made, Africa Bombasta, a visiting scholar in the archives, and they've done fantastic programs. But then I think it ossifies it a bit, because it's no longer a living archive. I mean, and I think that's a real challenge. Maristella, I was thinking, when we were at the CCA together, which is a time I so treasure with you as a mentor and a colleague, I remember one of your colleagues in the archives saying, well, there's also the problem of the tombstone syndrome, that architects themselves, they want to place their archival remains in an archive where Gordon Matta Clark or Peter Eisenman, et cetera, is. And, I think it's a very tough issue. I mean, I understand why Charles Correa wanted his collection to go to the Royal Institute of British Architects. And there is material that's also in his foundation in Goa. And I think, as I said, it's a wonderful program in which they have digitized and people can subscribe to it. But it does become a question, where should the archives be placed, and who do they belong to, and whom should they be most accessible to? Again, I think the digital can solve some issues, as with the notion of digital and analog collections that are in the same collection and can be read in some way together in a hybridized fashion. But it's a very, very tough question. I mean, I don't envy the archivists and curators on our panel. It's a delicate question as well. And I think these partnerships, they have to be approached with great tact, respect, and dignity. And the Sparrow Archive, Lakshmi was approached by SNDT, which is a women's university in Mumbai, and said, oh, well, we would like to acquire you. And she said, absolutely not. I would lose control over the archive. And I think she feared it would become ossified in some way.
Yeah, well,
it wouldn't be a dynamic living archive.
That's a very, very delicate issue, and it's very, very important. And I feel right now more and more the responsibility. Why? Because at this moment we go towards a diversification of the archive. We are more aware of the diversity. You mentioned something that it's I would say, allow me to say, typical of the ego of some of our male colleagues. There are important names, and I add my name, so I have like a medal. As you say, the tombstone and so on. But the problem is that the archive we don't want the archive to be ossified, but also the archive, they need to be available. Not always people can travel all over the world. And the pandemic tell us very clearly that it's becoming more difficult. So what does it mean? That only the Indian do research on Indian architecture? Are we a kind of new geography inventing? No, we need to allow this. So digital, it's it's a good way to start, I mean, discussing this. I mean, because from other points of the world, you can look at material, but it remains a very, very delicate issue. Yes, and the community archive are different, but they do belong to their community. That would be my answer, but it's not always the obvious situation. Meral, do we need to open to our chat?
I think that's all yellow hand.
We haven't
Q&A
listened your
time.
yes. First of all, thank you for your answers, comments, and suggestions on our panel questions. In light of your answers, I think that historical documentations of women architects, in particular women architects at the intersection of skin color, class, religion, nationalities, unconventional practices, and in addition to this, some biases in collecting historical documents, lack of labor and financial sources in archives are still ongoing issues in spite of the rising problems with deep-seated qualities in architecture. On the other hand, in light of your answers, in terms of collaborative actions for more inclusive archives and collections on diverse women architects, I think that some of your suggestions are partnerships between institutions and community archives, cross-disciplinary events between archives and architecture history, and creating new networks between archivists and diverse women architects, and encouraging women architects to look at their own work archivally, and so on. And thank you. And now, before turning to questions by our audiences, I would like to add a few points on our panel discussion. According to my recent research project on diverse and inclusive historical documentations at some pioneering schools of architecture, most of pioneering schools of architecture did not have systematic information, research, report, or mission of statement in effect on historical documentations of women architects. And secondly, and more critically, some pioneering schools of architecture did not have an archivist or curator specifically attached to their historical documentation practice. And thirdly, some schools of architecture did not have a woman architect in their archive, even from their own history, or they had only a few women architects in their archives. And fourthly, there was no information on diverse profiles of archivists in architecture. And within this critical landscape, I think that support by academic leaders in architecture, in particular, support by women academic leaders in architecture will be very helpful to make progress together. In addition, regularly meetings, panels, and discussion platforms to bring diverse and underrepresented profiles from architecture history and architecture archives might have very significant contributions to clarify existing problems and to create new solutions. I hope our online panel sends its message to relevant institutions and organizations in this evening and motivates them to take their actions. Now, I would like to turn to questions by our audiences for our 15 minutes Q&A sessions. And the first question is for Heather. How can we diversify our collections and shine a light on distinctive collection? How can we leverage resources in a time of austerity?
Yeah, that's the that's the eternal question, right? Honestly, I don't have a great concrete answer for that, except that at the Architectural Archives, what we had to do in the pandemic. So first of all, we're a staff of 3. We have a little over 400 collections. In non-pandemic times, we run a very busy reading room. We're beginning to build a sort of sustainable digital infrastructure. I think my colleague Allison Olson, who's our digital archivist, is here tonight, and my colleague Bill Whitaker is here tonight. You know, so perhaps they can jump in on the chat here to get anything I missed. But you know, what we really fundamentally had to do was to pause certain things, you know, when things shut down, and really prioritize access to the collection, because that access no longer became possible, right? So we had to do this exercise of what are our priorities? You know, are we just going to kind of ignore the world and, you know, pull out our backlog and start practicing things, or start processing things, you know, or are we going to kind of front load ourselves and really be that connection to the collection that people need at the moment? So all that rambling to say that I think, you know, whatever this has to be a core of what you do, right? Like, if creating more inclusive collections and representing the larger scope of history is important, that, you know, that needs to be in every aspect of what you do. It's not a side thing that you do. It's not like a project that like one and done, right? It really needs to be written into your collecting mission. It needs to be written into your, you know, into your workflow, your practice. There's not an easy way to do that, and not one way to do that, but certainly communicating that, you know, with, you know, your staff, your board on all levels. You know, everybody really needs to be kind of on the same page about that being not just a side thing, a fundamental part of your job. Thanks. That's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. And our second question is for Maristela.
Oh my God.
Where women and BIPOC folks have been systematically erased even when they were partnered with male creators or subjects of male creations, which propelled them to fame? Asked by Stephanie Bini.
Which prophet? Meral? I haven't
Pardon?
heard you. I
Okay.
haven't heard you at the end. Which?
I can repeat the question. Where women and BIPOC folks have been systematically erased when they were partnered with male creators or the subjects of male creations, which propelled them to fame?
Oh,
I think it's a question or a comment rather than a question. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I think that, you know, that's, I mean, Ether, or also our other, I mean, colleague, I mean, Jessica, it is a big responsibility, I say again, of the archivist to, you received an archive, and, you know, I mean, it's rich, it's diverse, and one thing that it's very, very relevant, and at least that's what I do, Heather, I don't know, or Jessica, in my work, I do work with the catalogers, because the cataloging aspect of an archive changes the history of the archive. This is my position. So you work with them, and step by step, those diversity come to the surface, I mean, out of the grain, I mean, within the grain. And it is surprising, because the archival practice for, I think, at least I started, I mean, working in an archive when it was 74, 75 in the Netherlands. There was no idea how the archive can be multi-layered. I mean, you think that's the archive, and that's the, I just number the drawings, and that's done. No, the multi-layers of the archive are really the crucial moment. And right now, more and more with contemporary practice, it wasn't the case when I worked in the Netherlands. It was the Berlage archive, the De Klerk, you know, it was a different profession. Now you go, as I say, to Frank Gehry, and there are all kinds of different collaborators, and it's more than collaborate. They are authors with him, and yeah. Often they are not mentioned, not often, never. Sometimes, so my point is, more and more I work with the when I have new archive. I mean, I work with the catalogers, and I start diversifying. I start understanding what are the layers there. I think, Heather, I don't know what is your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I can provide a pretty concrete example. This is by no means a underrepresented person, but certainly the idea of a female partner in a male partnership. But we have the Venturi Scott Brown collection. Yeah. And one thing that and it's a collection that's been coming in in chunks for 20 plus years, right? So one of the big chunks that came in just actually maybe at the beginning of the pandemic, I think Bill was in Denise's basement in like June or something, was one thing Bill really taught me when I came to Architectural Archives was to look where creators spend their time, right? And one question that came up in bringing in Denise's part of the collection was she invested very heavily for a very long time in maintaining this this bibliography, a series of publications about the work of the firm, about her work, and it was it was like 14 filing cabinets or something, and there was this we had this curatorial question of like, do we physically take that in? Some of it's digitized, some of it's not. Do we just sort of rely on what's there? These things can be found other places, right? It's not like these are publications mostly. And ultimately, we decided, look, she spent years, she had staff who worked specifically on this. She spent a lot of time dedicated to maintaining this collection. So we brought it in. So it's sitting in our reading room right now. But we decided to allocate resources to physically maintaining that part of the collection because we felt it was essential to her story, and how she felt it was important to spend her time as as a principal of that firm.
And I think that really touches on something that we haven't really talked about, even in the practice run and then today, is when we're out going and acquiring collections and talking to donors, really is the conversation and the relationship that we develop with donors, because that's how you find a lot of these sort of like constellations and relationships. And that's when you learn somebody's partner was actually really influential, even though maybe their name isn't on the stamp of the drawing. I think those conversations with donors are really important. And then it's important to sort of take that knowledge dump into the descriptive practices of the archivist. So like, I don't really do a lot of sort of like traditional rare book cataloging, but I do write finding aids. So in biographical and historical notes, in scope and content notes, that's really where, the archivist can illuminate some of these relationships that maybe would not be apparent from the outside. A good example of that at Yale is the Eero Saarinen collection, because he did a lot of work with Florence Knoll. And I think Judith McBrien is attending this, and she... Hello. Oh, hi.
Meryl.
Oh.
Meryl, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Oh, sorry. I noticed that I mean, there is a among the, I was looking at the chats, and Judith McBrien, she asked, if I was referring to Brenda Levin for the conservation processes and her practice. Yes, it's her practice, Brenda Levin.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I was giving Judith a shout out, sorry, really quick, just because in terms of, these relationships that archivists can develop with architectural historians through helping her is how I learned about all of the work that Beatrix Ferrand did with the landscape at Yale and on that campus. And that's a really like sterling example of a hidden voice because all of her drawings have James Gamble Rogers' names stamped on them. So these are sort of the things that as we learn them as archivists, we can use our descriptive practices to shine a light on, those hidden voices.
Oh yeah, that's very important.
Well, I just want to commend you all for curating such a diverse panel because, as was pointed out, Mary Stella, she's a historian, she's an architect, she's a curator. Heather is a photographer and archivist. Jessica has worked at the Capitol Archives. Now she's at Yale. And so I think the diversities of backgrounds that we bring, and here I'm also thinking of, what in the last 10 or 15 years, I think maybe it started at the Museum of Modern Art and then the Metropolitan Museum, that they would bring in artists to go through the collection and to curate an exhibition. So I wonder if we don't need, artists in residence in various archives, and how they would begin to interpret it, what they would find. And, not just artists, but, an engineer, going through a very high profile designer's work. And then to think about different kinds of programming, maybe they would make a film, they would do an exhibition, they would do interviews or something. So, I think to think about the archives is really a center of creativity and exploration. I think that, all of you really exemplify in your many multiple identities. You are doing it and you can do it. And the other thing I would say, I think that Mayor Stella commented on the need to reach out to architecture schools, which are so rich in Southern California. But I think architectural students and young architects in general need to think of creating their own archives. I think I said one of the saddest things I always see at the end of final reviews at Cornell is walking through the studios and seeing all the trashed models and drawings, all this hard work. I don't know, hopefully people are documenting it digitally, but I'm still an analog person. And so I think we really need to encourage young people to think about creating their own archives at different stages. I think someone has previously mentioned it on the panel as well. And that, again, I think Professor Frampton has mentioned this, that architectural schools don't do a good job in creating their own archives. At Cornell, we used to have it in the closet, and some poor beleaguered junior faculty member had to take it on, and they weren't trained as an archivist, and they didn't have the resources or the expertise or even the space. We do have, through the university archives, they do collect work of all Cornell graduates. So we have some of the early women architects represented there, but strangely enough, not the African-American architects who first came to Cornell, like Vertner Tandy, who were real pioneers in the field.
I think that's a really good point, Mary, because the other thing that encouraging young people or anyone at any level to, think about building their own archive, it actually subverts what we think of as this is an archive, this is an archive, this is not an archive. This is architecture, this is not architecture. Both of those professions have, a long history of, very narrow definitions of those words. And I'll just throw out there, one of the other hats I wear is, I do a lot of political organizing locally, and I started a group locally to deprivatize our local prison. We have the only private prison in all of Pennsylvania. Wow. And the main thing that I did there, and I feel like I learned almost as much doing that work as I have in other ways, is we felt like storytelling of the people who were affected by incarceration, their families, even people who work there, was really essential what we were doing, not only in humanizing the issue, but in building networks with those people. And so we created an archive of stories, and I don't think we really thought about it that way, but we've been doing it for about 3.5 years, and that's really what it's become. It's become this archive of stories, and it's people telling their own stories. And that has been a huge lesson for me as an archivist. It took me a while to figure out it was relevant to my professional work, of how and everyone tells their story differently, and that's just been immensely useful in terms of figuring out how people think about their own experiences and how they communicate them to other people.
Thanks, Heather. And now we are getting close to the end of our time. And dear Naomi, what would you like to say to close our panel?
Hold on just a moment. Let me see if I can manage to turn my screen back on.
Okay.
Apologies. well, you can imagine, you can see me. So first I just want to say that one thing I love about what we've done here today is I feel like we are not just talking about how to do these things we need to do in terms of collaboration, in terms of questioning how we do things, but we're demonstrating it through how we're now building these bridges and talking across disciplines. I think that's a wonderful thing. Other than that, I just wanted to thank you, Maral, for putting together this wonderful panel. It's been very inspiring. I've enjoyed hearing from all of our panelists. It's really been a delight. And that's it.
Thank you. And in closing, my deepest gratitude goes to our panelists, Women Who Design team, our audiences, and everyone who support us. After our panel, we want to continue this dialogue more broadly and deeply online. Please share your thoughts and questions and comments with us. We also hope to witness positive and structural changes in historical documentation practice and methods on diverse women architects. Thanks for being with us, and please stay safe. Thank you.